A woman walked up to a factory door in Kansas during World War II, ready to help build aircraft for the war effort, and was told she could not even begin. Not because she lacked skill, not because she lacked discipline, not because she failed some test of loyalty. She was turned away because she could not prove, on paper, that she had been born. If this kind of hidden history interests you, stay with me to the end. Share this with someone who still believes modern bureaucracy was built only for convenience, and follow for more stories that make the official version of the past feel a lot less complete. Her name was Grace Wilson. She was American-born. Her parents were American-born. Her grandparents were American-born. She had lived her whole life inside the country that now demanded a document she did not have. In frustration, she wrote to the government and explained what the experience felt like from inside the machinery. It was not just inconvenience. It was humiliation. It was the strange pain of being known by your neighbors, known by your town, known by your own history, and still being treated by the state as if you hovered in some uncertain space between real and unreal. Grace Wilson was not an exception. She was evidence. By the early 1940s, the United States had stumbled into an administrative truth so large, it sounded almost absurd. Millions of native-born Americans had no certified proof of birth. They had been born. Obviously, they had families, churches, schools, employers, communities. But the records either had never been created, had never been filed, had been filed badly, or had been lost in the cracks between old systems and new ones. Then the war arrived. And war has a way of forcing governments to discover exactly where their paperwork fails. Factories wanted proof of age. Military systems wanted proof of citizenship. Federal offices wanted proof for hiring, training, rationing, benefits, and labor assignment. Suddenly, millions of people were being asked to produce a document that, only a generation earlier, most families had never imagined they would one day need in order to work, travel, marry, enlist, inherit, or simply move through official life without friction. State offices were flooded. Requests piled up. Clerks faced lines that seemed to reproduce themselves overnight. People who had never thought twice about the circumstances of their own birth now found themselves hunting for midwives who had died, doctors who had retired, churches that had closed, county ledgers that had burned, and witnesses old enough to swear that yes, this person had indeed entered the world where and when they claimed. By late 1942, officials were openly describing the situation as a birth certificate crisis. Imagine that phrase for a moment. Not a war production crisis, not a transportation crisis, a birth certificate crisis. The workaround was almost surreal. In some cases, citizens could affirm their status under oath before a military representative. A spoken declaration, backed by threat of punishment, was accepted when the paper was missing. Think about what that means. The system had spent decades moving away from community memory, family testimony, parish knowledge, and local recognition, only to rediscover in emergency that speech itself still had to serve as the backup technology. If the form was absent, the human voice returned. That is the first crack in the story most of us inherit. We are taught to assume that modern identity documents emerged naturally, inevitably, as part of progress. Better records meant better health statistics. Better records meant less fraud. Better records meant a more capable state. Better records meant better lives. There is truth in that. Infant mortality tracking did save lives. Standardized registration did improve public health data. Reformers did need age verification to combat child labor and abuse. But the more closely you look, the less satisfying it becomes to say that this is the whole story. Because public health explains the opening move. It does not fully explain the empire built on top of it. For most of human history, ordinary people did not carry birth certificates through daily life because no one expected them to. Identity worked through recognition before it worked through files. A village knew who belonged there. A parish recorded baptisms and burials. A clan remembered descent. A neighborhood could tell you whose child you were, where your people came from, who stood beside your parents at your wedding, and who would answer if your name was called in a moment of crisis. This was not a perfect system. It excluded outsiders. It could be manipulated by local elites. But it rested on a principle almost opposite to the one we live under now. Existence was relational before it was documentary. You were real because people knew you. Then, in an astonishingly compressed historical period, governments across the industrial world began replacing that older logic with something far more centralized, standardized, and durable. In the United States, the machinery accelerated in the early 20th century. Permanent census administration, model certificate forms, standardized registration zones, more consistent state participation, deeper integration between local records and federal systems. Each piece can be explained in isolation. Together, they form an architecture. And that architecture did not stay politely confined to public health. It became foundational. Once a government can reliably assign you an official beginning, everything else becomes easier to build on top of that starting line. Taxation becomes cleaner. Schooling becomes more measurable. Labor regulation becomes more enforceable. Draft eligibility becomes less negotiable. Welfare distribution becomes more legible. Immigration status becomes easier to track. Pensions, inheritance, court claims, passports, licensing, banking, and eventually digital databases all gain a common root. The birth record becomes more than evidence of arrival. It becomes the first entry in a lifelong administrative chain. And here is the part that should make you pause. Most of that expansion did not happen through some grand philosophical debate in which ordinary people were invited to consider what it means for a state to define the official origin point of legal personhood. It happened incrementally, procedurally, bureaucratically, almost quietly. One form linked to another. One office required what another had normalized. One emergency justified a temporary rule that later felt permanent. One credential became prerequisite for another. By the time citizens understood the scope of the change, there was nothing left to opt into. They had already been entered. This is also why genealogy feels haunted. Anyone who has tried to trace family lines knows the sensation. You move backward through records with growing excitement. Grandparents, great-grandparents, an old address, a marriage ledger, a ship passenger list, a draft card, a county index. Then the trail begins to fray. Spellings shift. Ages wobble. A woman vanishes between census years because she married and the surname changed. A laborer appears in one township and nowhere else. A child listed in one record is missing in the next. Then, all at once, the search stops feeling like a path and starts feeling like a cliff. Genealogists call it a brick wall, but the phrase is almost too clean. A wall suggests deliberate construction. What many families encounter is more like a zone of historical fog, where the old methods of knowing ended before the new methods of recording became stable enough to replace them. The result is not just inconvenience. It is a manufactured shallowness in public memory. People begin to believe their history is shorter than it is, because the archive available to them is shorter than the lineage they actually carry. For African American families, this rupture is even more brutal. Before emancipation, millions of enslaved people were not documented as full individuals in the way free citizens imagine documentation. They were counted, priced, categorized, and listed inside a system built for property claims, not personhood. When later records begin to include names, those names do not represent the beginning of a people. They represent the beginning of official recognition by institutions that had long refused to see them properly. The archive does not start where life started. It starts where power decided to acknowledge what had always been there. Social media loves to flatten this point into a slogan. If you are not in the system, you do not exist. The slogan is too simple, but it captures a fear people instantly recognize. Try opening a bank account without the accepted documents. Try enrolling in school. Try proving your age after a disaster destroys your home. Try crossing a border, inheriting land, getting hired, claiming benefits, correcting an error, or recovering from identity theft when the databases contradict your own memory. In those moments, modern citizenship reveals its theology. The file is treated as more reliable than the person. The record outranks the witness. The system trusts what was entered over what is lived. And because we grow up inside this arrangement, we rarely ask what got displaced. Before standardized registration, your grandparents' world may have held information no agency today can validate. A priest may have known the old surname before it was simplified. A grandmother may have preserved the birthplace nobody wrote down because the family moved too often for county routines to follow. A midwife may have carried the only accurate memory of who was born in winter and who was born in spring because poor families often guessed at dates until a job, a school, or a military office demanded precision. Those memories were not nothing. They were a working archive. Fragile, yes. Human, yes. But real. Then came the paper turn, followed by the numbering turn, followed by the database turn. At first, the warning signs were visible. Early identity systems often insisted that the number or card was not meant to become a universal identifier. Officials claimed narrow use, limited purpose, administrative necessity, temporary scope. Yet bureaucratic tools have a kind of appetite. Once a number exists, more offices want it. Once more offices want it, daily life bends around it. Once daily life bends around it, refusing it begins to look suspicious. In a surprisingly short time, a support beam becomes the entire building. Most of us imagine our documents as proof that our lives were preserved, but very often they preserved only the parts institutions cared to collect. They tell you a date, a county, perhaps a parent name if recorded correctly, perhaps a certificate number. What they do not tell you is how your family understood itself before it learned to speak in forms. They do not tell you which name was dropped because it sounded too foreign at a hiring desk. They do not tell you which elder could no longer read the new language of bureaucracy. They do not tell you why a child was registered late, why a father disappeared from a line, why a mother gave one birth year to a census taker and another to a school board. They give you legibility. They do not guarantee truth in the fullest human sense. This is why so many people feel a strange emptiness when holding the papers that are supposed to define them. The certificate proves something crucial to governments, schools, employers, and courts. But it often says almost nothing about the texture of ancestry. It is all entrance and no memory. It can establish legality while failing to carry inheritance in the deeper sense. It can confirm you were counted while remaining silent about what was lost in the counting. And yet the modern world is structured so completely around this logic that questioning it feels almost childish. The serious question is not whether documentation has value. It obviously does. The serious question is what happens when documentation becomes the only language of reality institutions are willing to hear. Because once that happens, every unrecorded connection becomes officially weak. A family story becomes anecdote. A community witness becomes hearsay. A parish book in fading ink becomes an exotic curiosity unless translated into the acceptable format. An elder's memory becomes sentimental rather than evidentiary. A person can be surrounded by people who know exactly who they are and still lose to a missing record in a room full of strangers. That is not merely administrative modernization. It is a transfer of authority over identity itself. And maybe that is why the wartime crisis matters so much. It exposed the dependence of a modern system on paperwork that had not yet fully penetrated the population. Millions of Americans discovered, all at once, that the state had updated its expectations faster than it had updated the lives of the people subject to those expectations. The result was a collision. On one side stood living human continuity. On the other stood documentary eligibility. And in that collision, people like Grace Wilson learned a brutal lesson. Citizenship, in practice, was becoming less a matter of belonging and more a matter of retrieval. Can you retrieve the document? Can you retrieve the file? Can you retrieve the number, the copy, the seal, the certified line from the ledger? If not, the burden shifts back onto you to reconstruct a self the system should already know. That burden has never really gone away. It only changed shape. Maybe that is why this subject keeps spreading across social platforms, documentaries, family history forums, and long comment threads where strangers compare the same eerie experience, the same dead end in the late 19th century, the same missing county ledger, the same surname shift, the same ancestor who seems to appear from nowhere fully formed because everything before a certain date dissolved into rumor. People recognize the pattern even when they cannot fully explain it. They feel that something larger than bad luck shaped the archive they inherited. And whether that larger force was coordinated design, convergent bureaucracy, or institutional momentum, the result is still profound. A civilization that prides itself on records created a threshold beyond which countless lives become difficult to verify in its own preferred language. Then it trained later generations to mistake that threshold for the edge of reality. But the edge of the record is not the edge of the family. The archive is not the bloodline. The missing certificate is not the missing life. The state ledger is not the full measure of human continuity. That is the point I keep returning to. Not because I want to romanticize the past. Not because I think old systems were fairer. Not because every missing record hides some deliberate plot. I return to it because the modern mind is dangerously tempted to believe that what cannot be documented cleanly cannot be known meaningfully. And that is false. Entire peoples knew who they were, long before modern offices learned how to stamp, index, and cross-reference them. So when you look at your own birth certificate, notice both what it does and what it cannot do. It can unlock doors. It can satisfy institutions. It can anchor a legal narrative, but it cannot carry your grandmother's voice. It cannot tell you which stories were dropped to survive. It cannot restore the names never written, the records never filed, the baptisms kept in unread scripts, the rural births never registered, the courthouse books lost to water and mold, the kinship lines broken by migration, fear, reinvention, and administrative neglect. The document can prove that you entered the modern system. It cannot prove that the modern system ever deserved to be the sole judge of who you are. Grace Wilson stood at a factory door and discovered the answer before most people had words for it. She was known, yet not recognized. Present, yet not legible. American, yet insufficiently documented. Her humiliation exposed a transition that had already been underway for decades. The old world of social recognition was not fully dead. The new world of credentialed existence was not yet fully complete. She was caught between them. In a way, many families still are. We inherit the polished certainty of modern records at the same time we inherit the fractures those records left behind. We are told the system remembers us, while spending years trying to recover the people it forgot. We hold the certificate in our own hands and feel, somewhere behind the official facts, the outline of a much larger story that was never meant to fit on the page. And that story does not end where the archive goes dark. It begins there. If this gave you a new way to think about identity, documentation, and family memory, share it, save it, and send it to someone who has hit that same genealogical wall and thought they were alone.